If the mind is identical to the brain, then why don't they have the same properties? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher's Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Dualism in philosophy of mind is the idea that the body and the mind, or the brain and the mind, are two ontologically different kinds of things. Now, why would somebody believe that? Today, we'll look at an argument called the difference argument. And this purports to show that because the mind and the brain have different properties, they must be different things. Let's say that Socrates has the property of having a snub nose at time one, at T1. And let's say there's also a person at time one that has the property of not having a snub nose. So Socrates has snub nose at T1, and then person not snub nose at T1. Can those two people be identical? Can Socrates be that other person that we just don't happen to know that they're the same person? Like maybe we just say, oh yeah, there's this person. Oh, hey, it's Socrates. Could they be the identical? No, because they have two different properties, right? This is a principle known as the principle of indiscernibility of identicals, which says that when two things are identical, they have all the same properties in common. And it's a pretty well accepted principle. It's hard to see how it could be false. So premise one in the difference argument says that if the mind and some part of the brain, B, were identical, then they would have all the same properties in common. If the brain has a property, then the mind has to have it. And if the mind has a property, then the brain has to have it. Premise two, however, is that the mind has properties that B does not have, that part of the brain does not have. And what properties could that be? There are four properties that are identified. First, we have the intentional aspect of thoughts. Let's say you have a thought about an apple, and pretend we could assign every thought that you have to a specific neuron. I realize that's not the way things work, but let's just pretend we could do that. Okay. Now, your thought is about an apple. Is your neuron about the apple? No, right? That doesn't make sense. Physical things aren't about other things. You can have a thought about, let's say, Paris, something that's not physically here. Is your neuron about Paris? No. You can have a thought about something that doesn't exist, like Harry Potter. Is your neuron about Harry Potter? No. Physical things aren't about other things. This whole property of aboutness is called intentionality. And thoughts have this, but physical things don't have this. So the argument goes, your mind has a property that your brain doesn't have. It has intentionality, at least when we're talking about thoughts. A second property, let's say you perceive the color chartreuse. Now, does your brain turn the color chartreuse? Does it physically become chartreuse? No. And let's say you put your hand on a stove and it's hot. Does your brain get hot? No, it doesn't change temperature. Or let's say you see a train. Does your brain become a physical train? Is there a physical train inside your brain anywhere? No, right? So we have sensations, and our sensations are not identical to the physical thing in our brain, right? Otherwise, we would have physical trains in our brain. So the argument goes, we have properties that are not had by our physical brain, sensations. A third property, you view the world through a first-person experience. To take a very bad analogy, it's sort of like the way you would look through a window out onto the world, right? That's the way you experience reality. Or another example is first-person shooter video games. You know, that's the way that you experience reality. But when you look at a brain, is there anything first person about the brain? No, the brain is a third person kind of thing, right? We know it as an object. We don't look at it and see a first person thing. It's not like you look at the brain and you see a window out onto the world or anything like that. Now, don't get me wrong. The brain might be responsible for causing this first person experience. The brain might even be the locus for this first person experience. But when you open up a brain you don't see a first person experience anywhere in there. So the argument goes that the property of first person experience is had by the mind and is not had by the brain. The last property is a unity of conscious experience. So right now you're aware of a brown man talking in front of a stack of books and a surfboard and maybe some plants. You're aware of a lot of different things at one time and different kinds of things as well. You're aware of the quality brown, the kind man, the sound of talking, the relation in front of or maybe next to, the kind books, the kind surfboard, plants, all those things you're aware of in just one go. Let's say you assigned a neuron to the awareness of each individual thing that we just talked about, right? One neuron for the quality brown, one neuron for the kind man, one neuron for the voice talking, right? And I realize again that this is not how the brain works, but just simplifying it just for the sake of argument. So they all have individual consciousness. Do they add up together to make one overarching consciousness, one united consciousness? Because that's what we experience, right? You have a united consciousness of all the stuff that's going on. And yet, if your brain has got a bunch of neurons all taking care of different things, then how could that give rise to a united consciousness? Again, we might think that the different neurons all together add up together to make a consciousness. But imagine we had a group of kids and they were looking in a toy box, and one of them notices a transformer, and one of them notices a ball, and one of them notices a G.I. Joe, and one of them notices a bat, and one of them notices a frisbee, and each kid notices a different thing, and all together they notice everything in the chest, but no kid notices more than one thing. Now, would we say that all of those different awarenesses add up collectively to one united awareness, one united consciousness? No, that would be weird to say, right? It doesn't seem like consciousness works that way. And the same thing would be if we were to say that each individual neuron were to sort of contribute their consciousness and add up to a different consciousness, a united consciousness. It doesn't seem like consciousness works that way for two reasons. For one is that if we're talking physicalism here, then the brain is nothing more than the set of neurons, and a set is just a collection, right? Set is nothing more than a collection. So we have a set of neurons that are all having their own individual consciousnesses. To say that a united consciousness comes from that is to say that there is something outside of the set, which we're saying in physicalism is not true, right? There's nothing but the set. So you could claim that consciousness emerges from that set, but if you're talking about like consciousness really emerges, right? Like there's a real thing, consciousness, that comes about from all those different neurons going to work, then you're going beyond physicalism now. You're going into dualism. You're saying that some new thing is coming from just the physical parts. Of course, they're dependent upon those parts, right? The neurons might be the ones that are doing the work, and they might be the ones having the consciousnesses, but still we have some second kind of thing coming from them. Now, we might object and say, well, okay, maybe the set of neurons isn't having just individual awarenesses. Maybe there's just one central processing unit, right? Just one heart of the brain, and that has the awareness. And so we don't have splintered awarenesses. Unfortunately, there's good evidence to say that the brain does not work that way. But even if it did, if we had some kind of central processing unit in our brains, that central processing unit itself would be complex. It would be made of different neurons, right? So you would have this problem where the different neurons in the CPU would have different awarenesses, and they would have to add up to a consciousness. And we might argue, well, maybe just one of those neurons, right? There's just one central neuron. And now we can see how things are getting kind of ridiculous, right? One central neuron has all the awarenesses. Of course, that central neuron has parts. So what part of the neuron has the awareness? And we could get down to like a subatomic particle. And do we really want to say that some subatomic particle has all the awareness that we are having? That sounds totally absurd. So that can't be right. So the fact that the brain is on physicalism just a set of neurons makes it so that we can't have a unity of consciousness. And also because, here's the second reason, because consciousness doesn't seem to be additive, right? It doesn't seem like you have a little consciousness here, a little consciousness there, like two drops of water coming together and forming a bigger consciousness. Consciousness isn't quite like that, right? Consciousness, although you become more and less conscious, that doesn't mean that, you can add two consciousnesses together. It doesn't seem like it in any way, right? Otherwise, you just smack two people together and they just become one. That sounds weird, right? I don't know. So again, argument is that the mind has a property the brain doesn't, a unity of consciousness. Now, one important point is that when dualists are making these arguments, what they're not doing is positing properties that they say that they think will explain something in order to, and then saying, hey, look, the mind, the brain doesn't have these properties, the mind does have these properties. Because that's a mistake that a lot of philosophers will make when trying to respond to these. What those philosophers will say is, I can account for those things. I can, using just material things, I can have, this sort of map of reality that maps onto what you're saying about, let's say, intentionality, right? And it explains the input that the person's getting and explains the behavior that the person is outputting, if that's a word. And that's great, but that's not what the dualist is trying to do. The dualist is not saying, hey, there must be this property I'm reasoning to. The dualist is saying, I'm perceiving this property of intentionality, right? I'm looking in my mind and I see I'm using a word and it is about something. That is something that I have a direct access to, an immediate perception of, or I perceive that I have a first-person experience. And it's something that, again, I have an immediate access to. So it won't help if a materialist or a physicalist comes along and says, yeah, I can explain all that stuff. The dualist would say, that's great. Even if you could explain reality without positing, without reference to these properties, I'm saying that these properties exist, and I know because I've perceived them directly. And now that I've perceived them, I also perceive that a physical brain does not have these properties. So that's an important thing to note on this, because I think a lot of times with the responses to these arguments just misses the mark, is trying to respond to something different. So if any of those things are legit, if any of those properties are held by the mind but not by the brain, if the brain doesn't have any of those properties, then the mind and brain are not identical. And if they are not identical, that means that you have two different kinds of things, which is dualism. So dualism is true. One last thing to note, by the way, this is not an argument that, it's been used specifically for Cartesian dualism, but really it's open for all dualism. If you have a question on which one is which, or what is Cartesian dualism versus just regular dualism, you can check out my video on what is dualism. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Adios.